Let me turn my Wi-Fi off everywhere else.
Okay, so it should be, if I refresh.
We are live.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go on my account to make sure.
Yeah, I see it.
Retweet. Oh, exciting.
Nice.
There we are. I just saw us. And we're live.
Cool.
Look at us. Look at us.
Yeah.
Making things happen.
That's so cool. I didn't know we could do that. That is amazing. All right.
If you are here, yes. Oh yeah, pin it. That's a good idea. Yeah. Pin it. If you are here, leave a comment that you're here and say hi.
So they can't verbally speak, right?
No, it's just it's just they can leave comments, live comments.
All right.
Either from YouTube or Twitter.
Cool.
Let me go on my other account and retweet.
I'm going to make some changes to my screen just so that I can look at both at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you're watching, make sure to leave a comment that you're here. Tell us where you're watching from, what your name is. This is 4 people, but I don't know. It's probably... All right. Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my first live stream. I'm nervous. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm here with Russ. He is so patient with me.
Hello, guys.
So patient. Yeah. We were figuring out. It's my first time streaming. We wanted to do a live stream. I've been wanting to do a live stream with Twitter. And I also wanted to talk more about trauma. And I got really piqued from the last time that Russ and I spoke. He was my first guest on my podcast. And we talked about ADHD and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. But we only touched a little bit on it. I said, I want to go a lot more deeper. I want to learn more about it. And I had to bring Russ back on because this is his life's work. He does his podcast about ADHD and CPTSD. And yes, it's different from PTSD, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's the same principle, but different ways of how it starts.
So that's what we're gonna get into today. He's gonna tell you. I'm just gonna ask questions and learn along with you guys. He is going to tell you what is the difference between CPTSD and PTSD and how it impacts our lives. When did it start? What are the symptoms? Who's affected? How is it treated? And hopefully, if you guys have any questions, leave it in the comments, and we will try to answer them as we see them. So yeah, let's start with the basic definition. What is complex post-traumatic stress disorder?
Okay. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder is similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. The idea is the same. You suffer flashbacks from trauma that you have experienced, but the difference is whereas with post-traumatic stress disorder, typically it's a significant event, whether it's like a natural disaster. It's if you've been in a battle or a war and you're around gunfire, you see extreme death or disfigurement. A lot of police officers and ambulance people like that, nurses, even doctors, if they see a really significant event that is traumatic to them or even to another person and they witness it and their memory kind of grabs onto it and it's really stressful and it which is the whole reason as to why it's traumatic, because it's extreme. It's not not a normal thing that you experience. So they don't even necessarily know right away that they have it or that they've experienced it, but then it's in the future where they start experiencing like a flashback, and it can be directly related to at the time that they're doing their work, or it could be like at night where they have a dream or something that maybe not even necessarily related to it at all can trigger them, and they believe that they're in, like they're actually at that point again, like they're re-experiencing
They're
that
reliving the
actual
trauma.
event.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So they're not in place and in time. They're in a, they believe they're there now instead of in real time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the post-traumatic stress disorder from one particular traumatic event. Now,
Mm-hmm.
complex post-traumatic stress disorder, another word that's or term that some people use is childhood traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder, because
Mm-hmm.
um, a majority, or I wouldn't say all the cases, but a good majority of the CPTSD diagnoses are from childhood related trauma. And the major difference now is that it is repeated events at an early age that are traumatic, are dangerous, and it comes from signs of physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, extreme neglect. It can even be repeated events that that person experienced. So, like, let's say that child is going to a daycare or a babysitter, and that babysitter is abusive,
Mm-hmm.
and it's every time that they're there, they they come up, they're developing coping mechanisms as a child to try and protect themselves when this event is occurring, or when these abuse events or traumatic events are occurring. And this is so repetitive, like chronic repeated events, like abusive events throughout their childhood and into their like early teens. It depends on how long it goes for, but it doesn't necessarily matter the length of time. It's just repeated events. And then later on in their life, it could be in their, like when they're 18 or 20 something, or even from like myself in my 30s,
Mm-hmm.
where an event, something that is very stressful or very anxious, like high anxiety, or like experiencing health related problems that are causing a high amount of stress, it can suddenly, it's like a sudden trigger, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
it brings it out into your life, and then now all of a sudden you start having memories and you start having flashbacks to your childhood trauma. And that's where the CPTSD comes to play.
Mm-hmm.
It basically is, you start having flashbacks, and just like PTSD, you're now you're
Reliving the
now behaving,
experience.
yeah, you're reliving it, exactly.
Right.
And so you're not in place and in time. You think that you're actually the child, that the event that you're
Mm-hmm.
experiencing is
Mm-hmm.
is happening when you were 5 years old, instead of when you're 21 or 34,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's the, I could go into great detail, but we're not gonna, I won't do that here.
Yeah, you have to check his podcast for the more in detail stuff. He's always looking up the
Absolutely.
latest research. And sadly, there's not that much research on CPTSD specifically. It's not even the DSM 5. That's what you told me the last time we talked.
Correct. Yes,
It's
it's
been.
not officially recognized in the
Mm-hmm.
U.S. in the DSM-5.
Mm-hmm. And this is specifically like you have had to had trauma from childhood for it to be
Yeah.
categorized as complex post traumatic
Well,
stress
it can be
disorder.
childhood. It could also be in your teenage years
Your
too.
teenage years.
It's
Mm-hmm.
it's just the vast majority of the diagnoses that are occurring today, and since the discovery, tends to be from childhood, because that's when the brain is developing. That's when the memories are like, that's when we learn the most, and our development is at its peak, right? So that's when
Yeah.
it tends to be more common.
Um, so when did we first start talking about CPTSD? Do you know? Like, when was it first
Oh,
discovered?
I think it was quite a long. I don't know the exact
Mhm.
year roughly. I know that it was something that's been discussed for quite a long time, but because society and research and the understanding of the human mind has become more prevalent and much more like known,
Mhm.
the understanding of it is much better today. Like they understood, but they really didn't have a good grasp by any means as to what it was and why it existed. They just, because there were if people knew about it as much as today, back 70, 80 years ago, there would we'd probably be so advanced
Mhm.
compared to the way to how we are now.
Mhm.
um, that's just
Absolutely.
that's just the bottom line, is that our knowledge and understanding of it has really taken off in the last 10, 20 years. And that's evident by there's starting to be more and more psychologists and psychiatrists who have training and expertise in CPTSD. And
Mm.
yeah, 10 years ago, you might have had a heck of a time finding anybody, because it wasn't necessarily common by any means. It was still in its infancy as far as research and theories.
Can someone who maybe doesn't have a specialization in CPTSD but is a trauma focused therapist or psychologist, can they provide support to somebody with CPTSD?
They can,
Hmm.
but there's a risk that the support will be more harmful than good,
Why is that?
because the understanding of it and the methods that they would use to treat complex
Hmm.
trauma
Hmm.
won't be effective. It will, and there's lots of examples out there. Both
Give us just
I've
one
heard it.
example.
Okay, well, I know someone who went through multiple years of trauma therapy, but it was the under this it was not CPTSD related trauma, and or for that she didn't realize that time that that's what she had.
Hmm.
And the related therapy was like CBT, right? Where instead, so it's a it's a different kind of therapy, and it doesn't work because what you determine when you start to research and you understand CPTSD, and there's different theories about CPTSD, but they all sort of kind of lead to the same route, where when we're that child, we have parts, and specifically we have child parts that are born at that time, that their sole purpose is to protect us in the moments of the abuse or the trauma.
Hmm.
And there are people out there who are so severely traumatized that they develop uh, a a severe form of it called dissociative identity disorder, which
Mm.
is where they have different identities that are so strong and so present that the original person who had the trauma has no memories at all of what happened for the length of time that other identity was present. So they literally feel like they blacked out and woke up all of a sudden, goes, where am I? What happened?
Oh, wow.
It's that severe. And there are actual videos on YouTube
Hmm.
of people who have DID that they literally they switch personalities, and they're a completely different person, and they are different tone, different voice, different personality. It's very,
Amazing.
yeah. And it's actually, and it's a real thing, and that's on the very severe end
Yeah.
of the traumatic response. And
Hmm.
that's the theory, the one that I am working with, and that the person that I know that I've been talking about, their form of therapy is structural association theory, or structural association model, where it's 4-step processing, and they have child parts that are in separate locations in the brain,
Mm-hmm.
and they all have like their sole purpose, each part, and there's multiple parts, their sole purpose is to protect that adult or that child in that when
Mm-hmm.
they were born.
Right.
And the reason that we have the triggers and we have the flashbacks is those parts are coming online and are taking over, and they're behaving, but they think that it's 1987 or 1991 when they first came online and they were born. They think they're in a time when the child is, or that person is that child, and they don't
Mm-hmm.
know that he's now an adult, and his behavior is like, it's honorable, and it's great that that it's doing what it's doing, but it's not in time and place, and so it has potential to be inappropriate or dangerous for that person.
Wow. It reminds me of the Stages of Development by Erickson. Um,
Mm,
because trauma, and I talked about this, I think I mentioned it in the podcast that we did together, and I linked it, but I know that when someone experiences trauma, a normal person that doesn't experience trauma, like, go through these developmental stages, and you're supposed, as you age, you kind of graduate to a different stage, you learn different things, different coping tools, different things that you're supposed to just mature into. But when you have trauma, it stunts the growth of your brain,
right.
basically, and it stunts your
Yeah.
developmental growth. So if you had trauma when you were in, and I don't remember the names of, maybe I can just Google it, let's say that you had trauma in middle school, and there's a name for that section of life. You get stuck in that middle school mindset. That's why you see a lot of people that are adults, but are emotionally immature. You see them, they're adults, but they behave like kids. Sometimes they may not know how to process emotions because they didn't, that part of their brain got stunted by the trauma that happened to them, which is something that I had to recognize in myself, which is something that before my therapist went on maternity leave, we were starting to explore, and it didn't happen, which
Right.
actually I just called a trauma therapist. I don't know if they have complex, I don't know if they have any CPTSD, because I mean, I've to be very vulnerable here on here, like, I've experienced trauma since I was very little, like 3 years old, and like
Wow.
several other bunch of stuff happened, like, in my whole adult. So I'm pretty sure that I'm probably somebody who has, not, maybe not the severe kind where you're like don't remember, but like
Yeah.
there's just no way I don't have this, because I've just experienced so much, and there was like some of the stuff was like repetitive, like bullying, for example, like that. Can
Yeah.
somebody that had bullying when they were like in elementary school and middle school, can they suffer from something like CPTSD?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily have to be at the beginning of your life in the first few years. It can, because I had multiple stages myself. Like
Mm-hmm.
the beginning of my traumatic events, which caused my CPTSD, was from my
Mm-hmm.
childhood,
Mm-hmm.
but it it progressed further in school. So I had it. I was being bullied, and I had a misunderstanding in school. And as I went through my years of school and everything, you progress. You get to a stage where people know who you are, and they learn your behaviors, and I became traumatized at school and bullied and harassed and lied to and teased and everything, and it just added on to it. Like, it made it more complex, no pun intended. It's just it made it worse.
Yeah.
And it, as yet there's evidence when past, like, post high school, right? Like, I always used to think that it was just like because I was bullied, I learned to avoid people, or I learned to, I was naturally shy, or I was naturally not a very communicative person or very talkative. And you don't realize how far back it goes, how deep the root of the trauma is,
Hmm.
until you sit down and you learn about it, and you have someone help you identify where things are from. And
Yeah.
once you know, like, you understand CPTSD, like, and when I say understand, I mean you get the basics that are important enough to help you understand what is happening to you. Then you're able to finally see, this here is why this happened, and
Hmm.
this is why this behavior today is existing, because it's a flashback to when you're 5 years old.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it goes very deep, but you won't truly understand it until you've got a grasp on complex trauma.
Right. And I want to go on another little tangent. I go on a lot of little tangents, so bear with me. But I was
Yeah.
thinking one of my episodes that I worked on was a why we our brains tend to lean negative. Like we tend to focus on the negative. And I can only imagine that someone that has experienced trauma has this a heightened in them where they can only focus on negative stimulus. And
Right.
it went back into our caveman times where our bodies are designed, like our brains are designed to keep us alive, right? So we still have those is that what you were saying, like the mechanism in our brain that it literally is there to make us survive, and sometimes it gets confused by things like trauma, which is kind of what
Yeah.
it sounds like what you're saying to me. And it makes us a little bit, it just changes the way that our brains work. It changes neural pathways, the way that we behave, it changes our behavior. Like it actually changes your brain almost physically inside. Like this is
Absolutely.
how
It does. It
impactful
literally
it does.
does.
Can we
Yes.
talk more about how the brain structures change because of trauma?
Okay. Sure. All right. When we're a child, obviously our brains are just developing, right? Like, we
Hmm.
go through our stages. We go through communication stages. We learn how to talk. Our memories. We start to have actual memories stay in our mind. Um, then what happens is when you start having, like, when you're experiencing trauma, and like any form of it, and repetitively, you start to like, your experiences are developing memories, and those parts, when they become active, like when your part comes online, and it says, okay, this child is in danger, I have to protect it. So it does what it needs to do, and it could be anything. Like, it's not one thing every time, right? It could be where it learns how to negotiate with that person, or learns how to uh, block out, like, right, like, so that it has no memory of it, or dissociate, so that it thinks about something else, or pretends, or plays a game. Like, there's dozens and dozens of different examples. And so that child now, one takes a part of the brain, like a little spot in their brain, and it develops in there. And one is, it's separate. It's not linked with the child itself. So it has memories of that trauma, of the experiences, and the child itself doesn't, because the other part is now has taken over, and is doing its role like to said, to protect that individual. So this is where, in later in life, this is where the problem comes up, like, is because the child who's now the adult, has no actual memory of the event, because the child part was the one that had the memories, experienced the trauma and the abuse. But there's like a little kind of, like, almost like a single thread, right? And but it's not enough for them to be able to know each other. Like, they don't know who they are. They have no ability to experience the memories. They literally, which is why the work that you do is designed to, one, get to know the part, understand what happened, and then you have to trust, like you have to update that part, saying, like, literally, like, telling them that today is now whatever date, right? Today is now July 24th, 2022. I am no longer 5 years old. I am now 44. I'm an adult. I take care of myself. I'm no longer in danger. Like, you're updating the part so that it understands that its role in your life was awesome. It was amazing. It did a great job. But because the adult now is in control and is safe, that part can now, doesn't have to take control, doesn't have to come online and do what they thought was required, because they don't realize that it's a different date, different time. And so the whole step is to gain the trust of that part so that it believes the adult. And then what that does is that starts the integration of the neural network, like pathways in the brain. So eventually that part, over time, they'll kind of become one, and so that
Oh.
you're fully integrated, right? So that now the
Yeah.
adult has all the memories
Mm-hmm.
of the child part and all the events and the trauma. And then the child part now is aware that it's not 1982, it's 2012, and that the
Wow.
adult is in control. He's safe. We're not in danger anymore. So it's
Mm.
like a process, right?
That's amazing. That's so fascinating to me. Like, the whole science behind it and how our brains record events and emotions, like, it's just
Yeah.
absolutely fascinating to me how our parts of our brains hold its own memories, and then kicks in because that's its job. And sometimes it's overactive. Like, that's why we have anxiety, because our nervous systems are so hypersensitive, because there's that part of the brain that has that negative memory that says, "Oh, we are always in danger," because that is, I mean, I'm like having a moment right now. Just like, that's crazy.
That's okay.
um,
Yeah.
another tangent, which is why I love positive affirmations so much, because it's like you were saying, like, you have to tell the brain that you're not in danger anymore.
Yeah.
And which is why I
Yeah.
like positive affirmations when I have anxiety, and when I've had like moments where my PTSD was triggered during therapy sessions. Like, my therapist had to do like a laddering thing where she's like, "Where are you? I'm in my office. I am at home. Like, are you safe? I am safe." And so, like, you have to say these things like, "I am safe," to tell your brain, or that part of your brain, like, you're specifically talking like about one specific section of the brain. I've always
Yeah.
said, like, "Oh, I'm telling my brain, you're safe. You don't have to be anxious. Your nervous system, you can calm down. You don't have to protect me because I'm not in danger." But there's actually that one specific part of the brain that's responsible for that reaction, because of that negative similar, like that negative event that
Yeah.
happened. That stuff is so fascinating. Can we talk briefly about like the symptomology, like when now CPT is triggered in adulthood, or whenever it hits you, and it can hit whenever, right? It could hit you at any
Yeah.
stage of your life in adulthood.
Absolutely.
So when that happens, like, what kind of symptoms should we be on the lookout for?
Well, the it's different for everybody. Not everybody has the same
Mhm.
physical and mental symptoms, because it depends on the severity of it. It depends on the situation that triggers them. Uh, it like if it was very severe, then a lot of things, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be related to the actual event or the trauma itself, but anything could trigger them. And what ends up happening is they'll have, like, I think the major change is the way that they're acting, like the way that they present themselves. Like, it's slight, like, it's not, for a lot of people, it's not necessarily going to be a major change. You're not going to see an obvious form, right? A lot of it tends to be verbal, because that person is, the way they speak changes. Communication can change. They could be having a very difficult time communicating, like getting their point across. They could be breathing heavy, like they could be they could be sweating a little bit because they're highly anxious, or they're very stressed, right? Like they could be looking, they could physically be looking around or be on high alert. Like they might be a little jumpy, or they might be kind of fidgeting and moving around and not having a difficult time sitting still. They could even maybe start like showing emotional, like crying or anger, right? Like there's so many different possibilities. They could also, if they could go the opposite route, where they like literally become numb, and they're almost like as if they're sitting still and not moving, not talking. They look like they're completely zoned out, like they're not aware of anything going on. So, it'd be almost like you could wave your hand in front of their eyes, and they wouldn't realize that you're doing it. Like that, it's like they're completely out of their mind in a physical sense. Like it's if it would be easy if there were only maybe like a dozen possible like things that could show up, but because everybody has slightly different structures, and they have different parts, and they all have their own meanings, and everybody's different when it comes to how they present emotions and physical symptoms. It can vary. You have to learn. You're gonna have
Yeah.
to get to know that person and know their signs that they're having
Mm-hmm.
a flashback.
So, what I know from PTSD, one of the reasons why I struggled so much in getting an ADHD diagnosis was because PTSD and ADHD have a lot of overlapping symptoms, like not
Absolutely.
being able to remember stuff, like being
Yeah,
forgetful, um, anxiety. I'm blanking out right now, blanking out
that's
right
okay.
now. um, yeah, and like little things like that, like being anxious, being jumpy, being because and I'm familiar with the symptoms only because, and I do social work, and I've had to do several assessments, and sometimes you have to do like the GAD, like the PHQ-9, like all of those mental health assessments, and it'll ask
Yeah,
questions when it comes to the PTSD part, like do you feel like when you are in an area, like you're getting physiological symptoms and you don't even know why your like heart is racing or why you're sweating, or like it's all of these, sometimes these symptoms are physiological, and if you don't know why am I feeling like this, it could be something like PTSD or CPTSD, especially if you, well, it could be CPTSD if you experienced a trauma when you were younger. Everything's great in life, but you're like, why am I feeling like this? It sounds like that's kind of how it would be. Would you agree?
absolutely. It
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I may have mentioned it briefly to you the last time we talked, and I don't know if it was on air or if it was before, but I have done at least two podcasts where I was discussing the fact that there's a lot of evidence and there's a lot of research that has come out now where they're saying that a lot of adults who have been diagnosed with ADHD, or even as in their childhood with ADHD, are now discovering that they actually suffered from childhood trauma as a child,
Mm-hmm.
and developed their brain developed in such a certain way that it emulates and looks very much like ADHD,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because the way that the reason that they're saying this is that the an ADHD brain develops different than a neurotypical mind like brain, because of like the frontal cortex, or the frontal lobe,
Mm-hmm.
sorry, in the brain is where a lot of the ADHD related issues occur.
Mm-hmm.
And they say that the development due to the trauma and the child parts and everything like that, due to that happening, the similarities in the structure of the brain is so very close
Mm-hmm.
that a lot of people are now realizing, and I believe I am one of them, that a lot of their ADHD symptoms, or almost all of them, are due to complex trauma from childhood abuse. It's still relatively new. Like this is a
Mm-hmm.
very new thing. So 10 years from now, there's probably going to be a more complex diagnosis manual out there where someone's going to come in for an ADHD diagnosis and the psychiatrist's going to do more
Mm-hmm.
trauma related questions and investigating, and it may take 2 steps or 2 days to do it, right?
Right.
Because they want to identify and rule out, or say, okay, I think actually, based on what you've told me from your childhood and your past, that you actually may have CPTSD, and that is why you're having these symptoms that are looking a lot like ADHD. They
Interesting.
have There's a lot more research involved, because it's like anything else. You just can't have one person do research and say, wow, I found this out, and then it becomes fact and norm, right? It takes
Yeah.
time for more and more people to learn that and to
Right.
go, this makes sense. And then they
Mm-hmm.
obviously, all the major leading experts in ADHD and CPTSD and trauma, and everybody they kind of have to, go over it and go, this looks legit. This looks like it's for real.
Mm-hmm.
But it takes time, and
Right. And it's still
unfortunately,
new.
I wish it wasn't so long.
Yeah. And it sounds like, yeah, what you told me last time was that it's still a new, so there's a lot of research that needs to be done specifically to
Yeah.
see what where the relativity is. And I actually was just watching a TikTok this morning where they were talking
Hmm.
about trauma and how it causes, it could cause ADHD. It could, and it makes so much sense. Like if you understand like how ADHD behaves in the brain, or how an ADHD brain is developed from birth, um, the neural pathways are, they're not created how they're supposed to be, right? Quotation was like the normal, how the neurotypical way. And if you're born so what I'm understanding is that if you're born neurotypical,
Yeah.
and then you experience trauma in your most crucial times of development, those neural pathways begin to change, and then
Absolutely.
you start experiencing ADHD symptoms caused by
Yeah.
the trauma.
Yeah.
That's
Like you
crazy.
could. Exactly. Like you may not necessarily at one time, like at 6 years old,
Mhm.
you may not necessarily have very obvious symptoms. Especially like today, it may be easier to notice and to realize it, like, and diagnose it possibly,
Mhm. Mhm.
because more and more people, like in education and in life, are better aware of it. Like a lot of schools have programs and things in place to better prepared for this sort of thing, right?
Mhm.
And back in my day, it was, you mentioned ADHD, and I have a feeling the majority of them either had no idea what you're talking about or had very poor education when it came to it. And so they would not have had a clue.
Mhm.
And as far as I was concerned, when I was 5, I thought I was just a very rambunctious, very adventurous, very crazy kind of a kid. And I was, my way of being, I guess I want to say being controlled, but like living was being active and just being a kid, right? It never occurred to me at that time that what was happening was causing it or developing it. And I always, for the longest time, even growing up and into adulthood, I thought I had an issue with education, or I wasn't paying attention, and like I was being lazy, or I didn't care, or
Mm.
I was, like it never occurred to me at that exact moment that maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe it wasn't just that I didn't care, or I was easily distracted, or I got bored, or I thought it wasn't interesting enough, so I got bored. I didn't. None of that occurred to me,
Mhm.
and and it and most of it is because my parents didn't know and my teachers didn't know, so nobody thought any different. It was like, oh yeah, he's just bored, or he doesn't pay attention, or he needs more discipline.
Yeah.
That's a common thing back then.
Yeah, and that's why, and that speaks to why some women go undiagnosed with ADHD, because
Yeah,
society says boys are boys. They are rambunctious, they're loud, they can't sit still, they're running around. That's just kind of the culture. Like, that's how boys are. Boys will be boys, and that kind of mentality normalizes behavior that otherwise, if we didn't have that kind of mindset, like, well, this is not normal. We need to look deeper into it. And women, they're not raised like that. They're not stigmatized in that way. They're like, oh, they're quiet. They're taught to be quiet. That's how they're raised, and that's why it
yeah,
presents differently from them. Like, the way that our culture and society is influences those ways of thinking. And then and unfortunately, it stigmatizes the way that boys behave. It normalizes that behavior, and then it excludes another gender. It excludes, like, the girls, the cisgender girls that have the same issues. They just look different, because a lot of the times, for people that don't know, ADHD in women, it's mostly internalized. And as you grow up, it's all internal. Like, a lot of our symptoms are up here. It shows up through anxiety, depression, frustration, anger, like stuff like that. And even anger in men looks different, I believe. I think a lot of,
yeah.
how would you say, for, like, I mean, at least for me, like, if I'm angry, I'll cry. Like, what would you say, how does a man express their anger?
Oh wow. That's a difficult question to answer, to be honest, because
Yeah.
everybody's slightly different,
Mhm.
especially if they grew up with a happy childhood or not, or
Mhm.
if
Right.
they had a parent that was strict or that was
Mhm.
relaxed.
Right.
Um, maybe they lived up. Maybe they only had a mother for a parent, right? Or maybe
Mhm.
they were just with their
Mhm.
father. There's so many angles that can play into
Yeah.
what that child's like when he becomes an adult. Um, I'll give you my example. That's probably the best way to go about this.
Yeah.
I I grew up in a family where both sides had many siblings. Together, there were 17 on both sides together,
Mhm.
and so one side was behaved a certain way and interacted a certain way, and their personalities were like A. And then my other side was very opposite:
Mhm.
calm, more relaxed, more reserved. They like to have fun, but it's in a different way. Like,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So I grew up with two opposite influences. So I had a side that lived in where the proper way to take care of things was speaking up, using physical. I don't want to say violence. I mean physical ways of taking care of issues, and speaking out loud and getting into arguments. And but at the end of the day, they all get along and they're fine.
Mhm.
Then the other side was keeping to yourself, not saying anything, hiding it until it gets to the point where it's too much, and then you have an outburst. And they could be mad at each other for, I don't know, days or whatever, and then eventually it just kind of goes away. But they never really sit and talk about it.
Mhm.
So there's the two different influences, and on top of it, having the trauma, um, I learned that the best way for me to express my anger was to keep it inside unless I was by myself.
Mm.
So if I
Interesting.
was around, yeah, if I was around my, especially my father,
Mm-hmm.
but if I was around my parents and I was angry, I would keep it to myself, but you could kind of see that I was not happy. Like
Mm.
the physical attributes were showing that I wasn't happy.
Mm-hmm.
I can't really describe it necessarily. It would kind of be like being quiet or like showing like you're
Yeah,
not
just
looking at them.
internalizing it.
Yeah, exactly. So
Mm-hmm.
you're quiet
Mm-hmm.
and you're fuming inside and you want to speak out, but you know that it's
Mm-hmm.
not safe to do so. And as
Mm.
soon as you're like, when I would go outside or I'd go to my room or I'd be out somewhere and I would express my anger, and I would either like yell out or I would hit something or I would like throw something, or, and I hate to admit this, but sometimes when I run into something and it hurts and I get upset, I I wish pain on the inanimate object, because that's how I release my anger.
Right.
But I
Mm-hmm.
learned to keep it to myself, and instead of showing it and expressing it, I would become quiet and very, or I would barely talk. It would be like one word
Right.
answers. It would be a lot of, and it would be no eye contact. There would be you could totally tell that I was upset.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
that was my way. And
You're
but
so
some
right.
people,
It's different
yeah,
for everybody. Some people
yeah,
internalize it, and some people are very expressive.
absolutely.
Yeah,
There's
very
a lot
expressive.
of,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, there's a lot of kids out there that grow up with abuse. Like their father or mother could be an alcoholic. Maybe they had their own trauma and it's coming out, and
Mm-hmm.
they're taking it out on their children, unfortunately, which is really sad. And so that child grows up and repeats that. And so instead of it being kept inside and getting stronger and boiling inside, they express it immediately. And they
Mm-hmm.
do it either through verbal abuse or verbal language, or they express it physically.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But it's very explosive
Yeah.
reaction and right away. It's really
Yeah.
interesting. It's really interesting how different, and I talk about men and boys just because of like the culture, that
Yeah.
it's not like you said I didn't have a safe space to express my emotions. And I feel like,
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing for the majority of men. Like there isn't a safe space for men to discuss for boys. And like the question I keep asking, especially if there's a mom or a wife, and I'm like, how do you teach your boys? How do you create a safe space for your man to be able to express? And I can, if you're like already a grown adult and you've learned, how do you unlearn that? Like how do you s- learn to express yourself in a way that is healthy? Like, cuz you're not taught that. And I think even now, like, are we teaching our men how to express themselves, how to like channel their emotions in a healthy way? Like I just don't think that's happening. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it's just like I don't think it's happening now.
No. There are some. I
Mhm.
wouldn't say it's common,
Mhm.
but for the majority of boys and men today, they're still, no. They're not getting. They're not doing it properly. They're doing it in a way that's dangerous, that's harmful, that could cause permanent issues and damage in the past, whether it's in their relationship or whether it's to their own children. It's
Mhm.
not healthy because they they don't have their male role model, which for the majority of these kids tends to be their father.
Mhm.
If they have a father who grew up with this understanding that expressing emotions is bad, keep it to yourself, be tough, be strong, don't show weakness. If they grow up with that, that's what they know. And so they're going to repeat that. And unless somebody, whether that father or that child, when they start to grow up, unless they finally sit down and say, I can't do this, or I think this is wrong, and they change the behavior and they start saying to their child, whether it's, and doesn't matter who, if they have a boy who's 3 or 4 years old, and they start from the beginning saying, if you're angry, say you're angry, express your anger. If you're sad, express your fear, express that sadness. Don't be afraid to show how you feel. Don't be scared of that. That's how it begins.
Mm-hmm.
Without that, it's just going to continue and recycle itself over and over and over.
You like said it on the money. Like, it starts with being aware
Absolutely.
of yourself. Like, oh, I'm like paying attention to the way that you're reacting. It really does start with being aware. Like, that's something that's helped me. I mean, I'm to a point where like I'm too self-aware and like it affects me
Right.
because like it almost like paralyzes me at times. But it does start with being with paying attention. So like if you're a man and you're listening, and start being aware of like how you react to something like a disagreement, somebody criticizing you. I mean, sometimes like that hurts. Like if we don't handle criticism very well, like what's a way, like how can we learn to be comfortable with that? And it starts with being aware of how you are behaving,
Yeah,
and then okay, how can I make this a proactive reaction, not a reactionary.
exactly.
That's so important. um
Yeah. Yeah, the key is to knowing, is
mhm,
to realizing that this is what's happening,
right.
being aware of it in the moment, and knowing what has to be done, what you have to do there in order to break that chain or break that habit and change things for the better. And a lot of times it's likely going to involve a professional's guidance to help you get there, because we may see the steps that we need to take, but we don't necessarily know how to get there, or how to get past the the block, right? Like, and that block could be a childhood part, or a traumatic event that we haven't come to terms with, and we haven't grown out, like we haven't figured it out. If we haven't done that, it's way more difficult to get to the point where we want to be at.
Yeah, let's talk about treatment.
Sure.
What treatment is there? How can somebody start recovering from complex post-traumatic stress disorder?
All right. Well, the first thing before anything, obviously, is to find a therapist whose specialty is CPTSD. More often than not, a lot of the therapists out there who deal with PTSD or trauma don't necessarily have training and expertise in complex trauma. So the methods that they're going to attempt to use, and there's lots and lots of evidence out there that
Mm-hmm.
this is happening. They're going to try methods with that person, and unfortunately, it just makes it worse. They don't actually help. They don't start healing. It actually makes it worse, because they don't know the steps that are needed from day one onwards, that are
Mm-hmm.
required in order to
Mm-hmm.
get proper healing started. Because I've read, like, you may have seen it on Twitter, possibly. I see all the time followers or people on Twitter going into chats, or not chats, on Twitter itself, excuse me, and saying that I saw this therapist and he made it worse, and
Hmm.
or he was trying to bring out my trauma part, or my inner child, and I was scared out of my mind. It freaked me out, and now I feel
Hmm.
worse. And they weren't using the correct methods
Yeah.
to start that individual on the proper healing, right? Like they don't, and that's because they don't know that it's complex trauma, and they don't realize that they've got parts, they have these there's child parts that are not connected to the adult, and you
Mm-hmm.
got to take the right steps
And you
from the
have to connect,
beginning.
and that's the best
Yeah.
treatment. You say is connecting those two and knowing, like using a therapy form that connects those two
Yes.
disconnected parts in the brain.
Yeah, you have to communicate to them, you have to
Mm,
feel what they're feeling, you
mm,
have to like acknowledge them, like show them that you care, that you're aware of this, of that this trauma had happened. You have to show them that you're caring for them, and then you attempt to update and make sure that, and so that they are realizing that it's a different time, things are safe, and then over time you gain their trust, and then that's the step, that's what is required over time to get closer and closer to healing, so that one day, if either you won't have a trigger, or if you do get triggered and you have a flashback, that the adult will always be in control and will be able to take the situation and say, we're okay, guys, this is, yeah, in the past this was harmful, this was dangerous to you, but we're safe, we're okay. And then they'll go,
mm.
oh yeah, okay, right, yeah, I see. And then they back off, and the adult stays in control. And that's a obviously like an animated movie version of what happens, but it actually is like you're talking to a child. If you
Mhm.
think about it, it's like if your 5-year-old child came up to you and said, oh my god, something scared me, and they're crying, or they're really worried. It's the same thing, right? You're gonna calm them
I'm
down,
gonna
you're gonna
comfort
talk to
them.
them, you're gonna say,
Mhm.
yeah, you're gonna comfort them, you say, it's okay, you're safe, and you go with them into the room and check the room out and say, all right, there's everything's fine, there's no monsters, you're all right. And then they start to feel safe, and they trust that you made that room safe, or that you made them safe, and feel happy again. That it's the same thing.
Mhm. But to that child self that's still in you,
Yeah.
traumatized,
Yeah.
basically.
If you think about it in an interesting way, remember we were discussing the pathways, the neurological pathways, right? When you're talking to a 5-year-old child in real time, and you're the adult, your mind is fully developed, you understand the reality of things and situation, and you know that, well, one, monsters aren't real, right,
Mhm.
blah blah blah, all these things. Now, if you could be in the mind of a 5-year-old child, they have a really wild imagination, their minds are not developed, nowhere near the same as ours. So there are things that they don't understand, that they don't realize the reality of it, and so
Mhm.
it scares them.
Yeah.
So imagine trying to show that child for the very first time that you're safe, you're okay, there's no monster, blah, blah. They're not going to go, oh, I get it, yeah, right, like they're not going to be able
Mhm.
to follow in the same way. So think about it as that neurological pathway.
Mhm.
Over time, you repeatedly make that child feel safe, like that real child, and eventually they trust you, they gain that level of
Mhm.
trust, and the next time they're going to it won't be as difficult to calm them down, or to show them the reality that they're safe, everything's okay. It gets easier as you continue to do your work. So it's the same thing, it's just that instead of them physically being in front of you, now it's up here.
Mhm.
And the work's different, because you have to get to know them, they have to get to know you, you have to have that connection, and then you build that connection, and it's just a slow process, but it's the work involved that makes that one day down the road become
Mm-hmm.
reality.
And it sounds like maybe those flashbacks don't stop, but you just learn to
Um,
manage them, or do they
well,
go away?
depending on what has been said in research, according to newer research with CPTSD and the structural dissociation theory, if you do the work and you heal and you update properly and you do everything right and you do it enough times, they say you can cure yourself to the point where you don't have it anymore. And so you never experience it again.
Mm.
Now, that's the thing I want to people understand is that doesn't mean that every single person out there who has it 100% they're all going to have it cured. And the reason is because it's not up to the therapist to cure you. It's up to you. If you do the work, you do I and this is not an exaggeration. 5 times a day, maybe more, even when you are triggered or when you're not triggered, if you're always updating and you're staying in touch with those parts and you're getting, how are you doing, how's your day going, anything to say,
Mm.
like anything that's come up,
Yeah,
you listen to them,
like
and then
checking
you
in with
say
yourself.
exactly, and this is
Mm.
multiple times a day, every
Mm.
day. And that's the work. And if you do that work and you take it seriously and you stay with it, it will get there. It's up to you. No one else can do it for you.
No one else can do it for you. Yeah, and I see a lot like, oh, therapy didn't work for me. And unfortunately, it's because they didn't have the proper therapy or the proper therapist. There was a lack of
Exactly.
chemistry, and like all those people that probably have CPTSD and they've been getting worse because they were getting the wrong treatment and they didn't even know.
Yeah, they don't
That's
even know that they had
they
CPTSD.
don't even know. That's why this episode was so important for me, and I wanted to do it live because a lot of us have trauma. A lot, especially after
Yeah,
2020. um for me, it
absolutely.
brought up a lot of things. And for me, like, and I was saying, everyone's like, oh, how are you coping? Like, my depression's under control, my anxiety is under control, even though I had anxiety today, but I acknowledged it and I was like, okay, I have anxiety. And I never do this, but like I sat with it and I'm like, I'm feeling anxiety.
Hmm.
It's, you know what this is familiar. And again, I was like telling myself, you're fine, you're safe. I had to keep telling me,
Yeah.
I had my own mantra. I was like, I am safe, I am well, I'm home, like, there's nothing going on, there's no reason for my body for you to be feeling this way. And it's kind of like what you were like saying.
Okay. One thing. I just want
Mhm.
to interject one thing.
Yeah, yes, go ahead.
Everything there was really good. I think the
Mm-hmm.
only thing that you could change,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of other people would say the same, instead of saying there's no reason for the anxiety,
Okay.
what you say is, because think of it this way. Let's say, all right, you have CPTSD. You get triggered and you're having a flashback. Okay. So now your part is the one that's feeling this anxiety, feeling the stress. You're overwhelmed. It's not you,
Mm.
the adult, it's your
Mm-hmm.
child part. So what you do is you tell
Mm-hmm.
your part, I understand why you're feeling this. And you have every right to feel this anxiety. It could
Mm-hmm.
be whatever reason, right? It could be something that you've experienced in the past that triggers this anxiety. And so you say, I understand. You have every right to feel this. That's amazing. You're doing a great job. Thank you for protecting me. And then you go into saying, however, I'm, I'm okay. I feel good. There is no danger. We're safe. And then you update them, you praise them, you show them they did an amazing job. And then eventually the next time that comes up, you're going to be able to immediately go, aha, yes, and then take care of it right then and there. And then eventually over time, it won't come back.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. And somebody was telling me recently, and they probably that's where it came from, maybe. I don't know. But my
Right.
friend was telling me that um I needed to practice this split two personality, where it's me. There's two people inside me. There's me and like my youngest memory. Like, and she asked me like,
Right.
what is the earliest memory you have? How old were you? And I said 3 years old. Like, perfect. Okay, it's you, the adult, and then there's a 3-year-old version of you in your head, and
Yeah.
you want to like act in life, or like move around in life, protecting that child. So if something's happening, somebody's asking or trying to like impose or something, like whatever interaction they're like having with you, it's like they're having with the child. So you're the parent, and that's the child, and you, the inner you, is like the child. Are As a mom, as a parent, you're going to protect that kid, like, no, this isn't good for them.
Absolutely.
And that was so powerful to me, to like think of myself in that way, to even think of little me neglected
Yeah.
and forgotten in the back of my mind. But what it sounds like, what you're saying, we have to bring part out, become aware of it, and acknowledge it, and talk to
Yeah.
it, and soothe it.
Yeah.
That's
It's the
amazing.
same. Yeah. Think another way. I'm sure you've been in a supermarket
Mhm.
and there have been little children
Mhm.
who want that chocolate bar,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
They grab it and they come to their mom and say, "Mom, I want this chocolate bar," or whatever. And the mom says, "No, you can't have that."
Mhm.
And if the child has not been, if the discipline is an incorrect method, they're going to burst out and start crying, like complain that they want it, and they're going to beg for it. And the mother some mothers ignore the kid. Some mothers give in and give the chocolate bar to them anyways, and then others discipline the child in front of everybody.
Mhm.
So each method has its own consequences, right?
Right. Mhm.
Like the child gets the chocolate bar, it learns that all he has to do is throw a bit of a hissy fit and he's going to get the chocolate bar. If he
Yeah.
gets ignored, the child eventually realizes that his efforts are futile and gives up. But if he gets disciplined, he now is experiencing embarrassment. He may not even
Mhm.
realize it because he's a child, but he gets embarrassed because
Mhm.
his mother has yelled at him in the store. He feels shame, he feels sad, and he feels like, oh, I'm so sorry, and he pouts and because he's a kid, he's not just going to go, oh, I'm sorry, and be quiet. He's going to pout a bit. And so that right there is developing. And if it happens multiple times, it develops in their minds as a way of, this is what's going to happen if this scenario occurs. So it's how you are brought up. It's how that parent decides what they're going to do with that child.
Wow.
If you're always being negative towards that child, like if that child comes up to you and says, or like wants attention,
Mhm.
right, or wants to do something, and that parent, either because they're busy at work or they're too involved in their own thing, and
Right.
either doesn't really say anything and goes, oh yeah, that's great, doesn't look at them, doesn't praise them, doesn't even say good job, and didn't go
Mhm.
back, then that kid's going to start to think that it's pointless because their parent A is neglecting them and B doesn't really care and doesn't think that they're important. And so they start to develop this idea in their minds that their parent doesn't really care about them, doesn't.
Wow.
There's multiple things that could occur from that.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it's the same way. Like there are some therapies out there that believe that this inner critic, this part is an inner critic.
Mm.
And some of these therapists think that the idea is to tell that inner critic that they're wrong. And some people think this is a correct method of working through the complex trauma, but in
Okay.
reality that is incorrect, because
Mhm.
if you can't gain the trust of that part, you'll never be able to connect with them, because the more damage you do, one, the more distrust they have,
Yeah.
and it's going to take even longer to gain their trust, so that you guys, that you and that part connect and heal. That's a negative, it's just like a negative disciplinary action against children. It's no different.
Yeah.
You have to show them that they're great, they're awesome, they're amazing, but you also have to show them that there's a reason, or that there's positive reinforcement,
Mm.
even if they're not getting that chocolate bar. You're showing them that there are other things that can happen, or I don't
Like
know
in
the
a
exact.
different
Yeah,
way. You just teach them
yeah,
a different, more positive way,
yeah,
more positive than the negative reinforcement, like those negative
exactly,
actions, a negative form of
exactly.
discipline. Wow, this
Yeah,
stuff is fascinating. Russ, thank you so much for having this conversation. I'm learning so much from you, from your podcast.
perfect.
Guys, make sure that you guys are following him. Um, on Twitter, he is ADHD and CPTSD, but his podcast, let me pop it up here really quick. You can subscribe and listen to him on Apple Podcast.
Yeah,
Is that the only place that your podcast
I'm
is?
everywhere.
He's everywhere. Everywhere you
Yeah,
listen to your podcast, go find him. Living with ADHD and CPTSD. He does do
absolutely.
separate episodes. He doesn't always talk about ADHD. He has his CPTSD episodes and his ADHD episodes. Make sure to check that out if you're interested into this. If you think that's something that you might be struggling with, start by listening to his podcast. Educate yourself, become aware, and then talk to your doctor. Always talk to your medical professional
Absolutely.
about what's going on, and so you can get properly referred to the necessary help, and like knowing how to ask for help, which I'm sure that Russ goes over in his podcast. So make sure to follow him. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Russ. Is there anything else that you want us to know about CPTSD that you just like really want to like drill into us, like really resonate with what you have learned so far?
Yeah. Yes, there is. The key to healing is just like, and you think about it, positive parenting with your children. Your role for that child is to bring them up so that they have a happy life, so that they can be at some point responsible, be able to make proper decisions, learn proper behaviors, proper etiquette, proper social cues, all these different things that your main purpose for their life is to make sure that they have a place to live, they have shelter, they have food, they are taken care of.
Mm-hmm.
And when they feel sad or they feel extremely happy, you're there for them to show them that it's okay, that this is life, these things happen, but you're going to be fine. It's the same deal.
Mm-hmm.
You want to heal, so you have to show your parts that are in there, that are experiencing these triggers and flashbacks, that we're okay. Yes, what happened in the past was bad. It was horrible and we
Yeah.
did not deserve it, but it's
Yes.
okay. We're going to be okay. That's what we want.
I love it. Wow. Thank you so much, Russ. Again, great conversation. Thank you so much for
Absolutely.
teaching
My
me and
pleasure.
whoever listens. And guys, like I said, make sure to find him at ADHD and CPTSD on Twitter, and then follow and listen to his podcast, Living with
You
ADHD
bet.
and CPTSD podcast. I will link everything
Yeah.
in the show notes, in the comments, everywhere. And if you missed this, catch the replay. Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.